All right, welcome to NNP Symposium. This is the 3 o'clock Eastern Time session, the nation's earliest congressional medals. Chris Neuzil presenting. And by way of introduction, the earliest US congressional medals from the Quasi-War with France through the War of 1812 are largely unfamiliar today, even in numismatic circles. They were a statement of sovereignty by the young republic and a technological headache for the first mint. This talk provides an overview of these early congressional awards and discusses numbers struck in rarity, differences between original versions, restrikes, and copies, the difficulties encountered by the mint in making them, and the questions that still surround them. All right, with that, Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Len. And I want to start by saying thank you to Numismatic Portal and the symposium organizers for giving me a chance to talk about these early congressional medals and make sure we're all on the same page. These are the medals that were awarded by the U.S. Congress, the Congress operating under the Constitution, basically as we know it today, and not the earlier medals awarded during the Revolution by the Continental Congress. And all of those, with one possible exception, the Revolutionary War awards were made by French artists and produced in France, at least originally. So these are medals of the U.S. Congress, and I will be addressing this series of medals using both documentary evidence and the physical evidence. And the physical evidence is the medals themselves, and using those two sources of evidence to get at some of the answer some of the questions that we have about these pieces, and to outline the questions that remain. And I'll be talking about the original medals, restrikes, and just by way of definition, restrikes in this context are medals struck with the original dies, but not at the original time and under different circumstances than the original medals. And copies are those struck with dies that have been copied from the originals, but are not the original dies. And there are differences which I'll talk about. And there are various versions of each of these. So there's a rich mix of versions of these medals. So it's a really interesting area for historians and collectors alike. And there's a lot going on. I'll try to get you familiar with some of those aspects. So let's talk about the original medals first. And by the way, the background that you'll see here on some of these title pages, that's the Battle of Plattsburgh. There were 4 gold medals awarded in this battle, which is hardly even remembered today. And that was the most gold medals for any, what you might consider any single engagement. Okay, here's a trivia question for you. Who was first awarded a medal from the U.S. Congress? And the answer is Thomas Truxtun, captain in the Navy. And the war, or Quasi-War, was there was a bit of a scuffle with France. The French were harassing U.S. merchant shipping, and Truxtun engaged with a French man of war, defeated them, and was awarded the first congressional medal, U.S. congressional medal, in 1800. And this was the first medal, congressional medal, that we know was made in America. And as such, it was a bit of an experiment, and not everything went well, as might be expected. I also point out that, and I'm going to try to get a pointer, that he attached himself, hanger so that he could wear the medal. Many of the medals I'll show you were modified one way or another. This is the gold original at the Smithsonian. And as I say, it was an experiment, and there were several problems with the medal. The most obvious, or they got the, what could possibly go wrong? Well, they got the date of the battle wrong, and it's very hard to see here. Maybe I can enlarge it. They show it as now corrected as February 1800, but this had to be corrected. They got the date of the resolution wrong. It was shown as 24 March when in fact it was 29 March. And let me see if I can get back into the regular mode, which I'm having trouble doing here. Let me, there we go. And the reason we know this is that had to be corrected is this is a white metal version that was struck right after the gold medal. And on it, the date is actually wrong. Here it has shown as March 1800, and the original date shown as 24 March. So the other thing about this medal is that Truxtun, when he saw it, hated the portrait. And I think it's somewhat understandable. And no one would look at this and say that was a flattering profile that was on the medal. And I don't know whether the Bass Otis painting, painted portrait shown here, is being kind to Truxtun, but certainly the medallic portrait was not very flattering. And there was another problem I'll talk about later, but this is certainly a rocky start for the first US Congressional medal. The next medal that the Congress issued was only about 5 years later. This was to Edward Preble. This was during the Barbary Wars, suppressing the Barbary pirates operating from the north coast of Africa and harassing US shipping in the Mediterranean. And one of the things, this is Preble's gold medal. It's in the Naval Academy Museum with its original case. And this medal really set the pattern for the medals that would follow in the War of 1812 in terms of size and the obverse portrait and reverse battle scene. And Preble, in the Barbary War, had a number of young officers serving with him who later went on to distinguished careers themselves, including Thomas McDonough, James Lawrence, Stephen Decatur, all of whom actually won their own gold medals in the War of 1812. And moving on to the War of 1812, this is one of the gold medals issued. This is Captain Lewis Warrington. This is this is the gold original in the Naval Academy Museum. And here we see some of another modification that sometimes happens to these medals. In this case, it's soldered into a brass base. Someone at some point thought this would be a good way to display this medal. So again, this is in the same format as the Preble medal, and these are 65 millimeter diameter medals, about 2.5 inches, so they're fairly large. And the size of these things is some of the problems that the MIT have, which I'll get into a little bit later. One of the new things about that came about in the War of 1812 was that the congressional resolutions specifically mandated silver versions of the gold medals be presented to the commissioned officers that served under the commanding officers that received the gold medals. And these are two such silver medals, Isaac Hull and William Bainbridge, both commanding USS Constitution. And in fact, Hull's was the first major victory of naval arms in the war and of American arms in the War of 1812. And this is the battle, Hull on the right there. This is the battle in which Constitution got the nickname Old Ironsides, and hit the gentleman on the left, Captain William Bainbridge, took over command after Hull rotated out of command of Constitution. These two medals were presented to the ship's surgeon, Amos Evans, and descended in his family until reaching the numismatic market not too many years ago. And at this point, you know, the fact that these were given to a surgeon gives me the chance to tell you that, or emphasize how brutal naval warfare was at the time. It was really a blunt force trauma kind of combat. And the wounds and injuries that sailors received were grievous, to say the least. And for example, in the Hull's victory, after the battle was over, both Evans and his counterpart, his British counterpart, labored through the night trying to repair and bind up these terrible wounds that were inflicted in this kind of combat. And a wonderful book, Ian Toll's Six Frigates. He tells the story of one American sailor, Dick Dunn, who was cursing the surgeons and called them a cruel set of butchers while they were cutting off his leg, because of course there was no general anesthesia at the time. So limbs, arms and legs were amputated, and the best you could hope for was maybe some alcohol or maybe some laudanum to deaden the pain. But it was a terribly brutal form of warfare. Also a first for the US Congress during the War of 1812 were medals to Army officers. And this is General Winfield Scott, his gold medal. This is owned by the Army now. But again, in the same format as the Navy medals. Now, in this case, for reasons that are not clear to me, although Congress authorized silver versions to junior or subordinate officers on vessels, on ships, in land battles, only the gold medal was mentioned in the congressional resolutions. However, more than one Secretary of War took it upon themselves to have extra versions of the gold medal struck in white metal. And this is one such medal. This is the General James Miller. And a couple of things about this medal. One is, well, you can see that this particular medal shows off the finish that's imparted onto these things when they're struck. And it's very similar to modern day proof coinage, where you got the mirrored fields and the frosted relief. And that was done by pickling the dies in acid, etching them basically, and then polishing the high parts of the die, which would be the field of the metal. And the other is the reverse of this is one of the more elaborate reverses, showing in long perspective the battle scene. It's a very complicated scene. And whereas first who engraved, he did the dies for all but Hull's medal in the 1812 series, charged a few $100s for portraits and allegorical scenes for the reverse of these medals, but over $1,000 or more for these intricate battle scenes. So they were quite expensive to produce. Most of you probably never heard of, or most of the general populace have probably never heard of James Miller. However, if you were ever read The Scarlet Letter, as I had to in high school, you actually did read about him. It turns out he was deputy collector in the Salem Custom House when a young Nathaniel Hawthorne took over running the custom house in Salem. And in his introductory to the Scarlet Letter, he talks extensively about this now elderly gentleman, James Miller, who had been a hero in the War of 1812. And he says he was as much out of place as an old sword, now rusty, but which had flashed once in the battle's front and showed still a bright gleam along its blade. You know, as out of place as an old sword would have been on the inkstands, paper folders, and mahogany rulers of the deputy collector's desk. So I'm going to take you now to one of the most isolated places on Earth, in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. This is the island of Tristan da Cunha. It is about halfway between Brazil and South Africa. And even today, and it's an inhabited island, even today, if you wanted to go there, what you would probably end up doing is flying to South Africa and then waiting for a ship to take you on a 6-day voyage, which would land you on this island. There's no airport. Gives you some sense. This is a volcanic island on the mid-Atlantic ridge. Really isolated. And in March of 1815, now we're something like 3 months after the War of 1812 has ended, after the Battle of New Orleans. And James Biddle, who's commanding USS Hornet, runs across HMS Penguin off Tristan da Cunha. They engage in a battle because word has not reached them that the war is over. This is the last shots, to my understanding, fired in anger in the War of 1812. And is given a medal by Congress. This is a white metal version of the medal, and you probably can't see it, but Jim Cheevers pointed out to me that in his portrait, Biddle is wearing his father's Society of the Cincinnati badge on his uniform. And here you see in the background, in the battle scene, not somewhat exaggerated, but not too inaccurate representation of Tristan da Cunha. Now, one of Biddle's young officers, a young lieutenant, was named Isaac Mayo. And this is the silver Mayo. And again, we're seeing some of the modifications that were done by the people to whom these medals were presented. And in this case, Mayo actually replaced Biddle's name with his own engraved. He at one time had this suspended on a hanger, so he presumably wore it on certain occasions. And what you can't see is that the wording of the letter from the secretary of the medal was engraved in 2 lines all along the edge of the medal. So Mayo was quite proud of this medal for sure. Mayo was a rather conflicted and in some ways tragic individual. He had a long career with the Navy. He was involved in the Mexican War, was a slaveholder from Southern Maryland, and was at that same time a commanding a squadron, Commodore of the Africa Squadron, that was tasked with suppressing the slave trade off the coast of West Africa. That was in the early 1840s. In the mid 1840s, he was on a committee that was considering what kind of naval school was needed to train young officers. And that became the result of that committee was the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. And the reason it's in Annapolis, and here we are looking towards the Severn River, to our backs in this view, is the South River. The reason the Academy is here is that Isaac Mayo's home was just on the other side of the South River to our backs. So the consensus is that he was very much behind the location of the Naval Academy. Now, the tragedy in his life came about because of his Southern leanings. At the outset of the Civil War, he wrote a letter resigning his commission to the newly elected president, President Lincoln. And it was a rather scolding letter, lecturing Lincoln on how wrong he was to have insist on not permitting the South to secede, Southern states to secede. And as a result, Lincoln, rather than letting him resign, actually dismissed him. It's the difference between being fired and resigning. And so this was a stain on a long and otherwise stellar career. And Mayo died about this time, and the thinking is that he actually took his own life because of this, and that was the tragedy. In the 1970s, his descendants, by the way, started a procedure of the Naval Board of Corrections to allow to revise his record to show that he had resigned. Other Southerners had been allowed to resign their commissions, and it was only a few years ago the Board of Corrections actually allowed that to happen. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about restrikes. So the dies for these medals, which are owned by the Navy and the War Departments, were kept by the Mint. And sometime, probably starting in the 1840s, the Mint took it upon themselves, supposedly with the permission of the owners of the dies, to start making restrikes of metals, mostly in copper, but also in other metals. Silver, as far as we know, although they actually did offer to restrike them in gold on occasion, although that as far as I know, never happened. In any case, the issue with the restrikes is that they're struck from the same dies. They're struck at the U.S. Mint like the earlier metals were. How do we tell them apart? Especially because a lot of the records indicate that both the Navy and War Departments talked about ordering strikes originally in copper. So, well, let's look at some restrikes, and we'll get to that issue. This is William Burroughs' medal. This was a battle in 1813 off of the coast of Maine, and it's unusual. The medal, this individual medal, is unusual because it's a copper medal, but it's unbronzed. It's in raw copper. Most were bronzed, but it's also unusual in the series in that it does not depict a portrait of Burroughs. It's an elaborate sarcophagus and urn, and the reason is that Burroughs was killed in the battle, and there were no portraits of him that could be located in any event. And the Navy Secretary settled on showing the sarcophagus and urn and military trophies. His second in command, who assumed command when Burroughs was mortally wounded, Edward McCall, was also given a gold medal. This is a copper restrike of that. This is a bronzed copper medal, but shows the proof-like characteristics pretty well. And at this point, this is a point to bring up the fact that a medal like McCall's, where he was not the overall commander, he was under Burroughs, would not have been ordered in silver. The silver medals awarded would have been Burroughs, copies of Burroughs medals. And this is true for another three other of the Navy's medals, that no silver versions of them were originally ordered, and as far as I can tell, or struck. So that was actually a relatively small engagement. Those are small vessels. They were sloop-rigged ships. There were only a total of four officers on board the American ship, including Burroughs himself, which is why, as a lieutenant, he was given command of this vessel. But these kind of things, even a small engagement like that, loomed large in the American consciousness, because this is really a David and Goliath kind of thing. Great Britain literally did rule the seas. And even if a victory like this was celebrated, and this is a political cartoon, James Madison giving King George a black eye and a bloody nose. This is a play on the name of the British ship Boxer. And as I say, this was a matter of celebration, which makes what I'll tell you all the more ironic, because remembering the Burroughs medal itself, showing the sarcophagus and the urn, and how celebrated even these small victories were. This is an article from the Niles Weekly Register 2 years after Burroughs and his opposing captain, the British captain, also died. 2 years after they were both buried in Portland with full military honors, about a visitor from New York visiting the cemetery. And he relates that the only way he could locate Burroughs' grave was by finding the grave of the British captain. There was almost nothing or nothing marking the location of Burroughs' grave. Really ironic, especially in terms of the way his medal was, the design of his medal. Anyway, this gentleman, apparently a gentleman of some means, paid to have an enclosure and a marble slab placed over Burroughs' grave. And I need to, I skipped ahead. My apologies. And about 60 years later, a painting of the graves shows what they looked like, and it looks much the same today. And this is Burroughs' grave here. The British captain, Blythe was his name, is buried here, and one of Burroughs' other lieutenants is buried here. But it's rather ironic that someone had to wander through the cemetery and pay for a marker for Burroughs. So while medals were being restruck, and they were restruck extensively, and I'll get into the numbers later, and also while the original medals were being struck in some cases, there were problems with the dies, and dies had to either be redone in the case of some of the originals, or later on when the Mint was striking them, they would simply copy the dies and start striking medals from them. And I apologize. Yeah, okay. I got ahead of myself. So since the restrikes are done from the original dies, one of the questions that arises is, how do you distinguish original medals from restrikes? So it turns out, and this is based on studying a large number of silver and the original gold medals, and also a large number of the white medal versions of the Army medals, that probably the most definitive and universal indicator of originality in these medals is that the original medals all have collar marks. And collar marks are marks that are imparted by the lateral constraints on the medal when it is struck. And I'll get into how that might have occurred in a moment. But these are pictures of collar marks on a gold original, the Winfield Scott, on a Oliver Hazard Perry original in silver. And here's an original, this is the James Miller white medal specimen you saw earlier. And what I'll tell you, having looked at probably, I think, half a dozen of the gold medals, any number of the silver medals, and also the white medal versions, that all of these medals that have clear provenance, the gold medals, of course, but the silver medals that have clear provenance to awardees always have collar marks. So then the question becomes, why do they have collar marks and what caused the collar marks? And one hint comes from a document. This is a mint invoice to the War Department. This is in 1836, but they're invoicing the War Department for the cost of the gold medals, the 10 of 11 Army gold medals that have been struck at that time. And among the list of the expenses is a line that says collars and hooping. And hooping is what got me wondering about what role that might have played. And one idea, and this is just one possibility, is an arrangement something like this, where there's a collar, an oversized collar, with a slotted hoop that fits inside of it and accommodates the upper and the lower dies and the planchet. And that when the medal is struck, the slotting in the hoop imparts the collar mark. Now, then the question becomes, if this is in fact is anything like what the mechanism looked like, and perhaps somebody who's listening in may have some thoughts or ideas about this, or some insights, additional insights, is why would you go, to this extent? And two possibilities, possibly three possibilities. That one, maybe the least likely, all the dies were individually made, handmade, and they might have been slightly different diameter. And to accommodate the slight differences in diameter, rather than remaking a collar, they would make a hoop insert that could accommodate the different diameters. Although the measurements of diameters of original metals don't vary that much. Another possibility is if the hoop is rather tall, it would help guide the upper die, the hammer die, as it came down, and keep it from accidentally hitting the collar and being damaged that way. And certainly I'll show you some examples where the edges of dies, these dies are often damaged. But I think maybe the most likely possibility is that this somehow helped get the struck metal out of the collar once it was struck. Anyway, maybe some of you out there have some ideas on this. But that idea of the use of hoops explains the different types of collar marks. Some are ridges, which might be with the hoop, there's a gap and where the slotting occurs. There are offsets, which might occur if the hoop was machined to slightly different thicknesses on either end of the slot. And then there are very faint color marks, as on the Winfield Scott medal, where everything was pretty tight and close. So that is able to explain what the color marks look like. So, and this is where I had ahead of myself a little bit before. While restriking, doing all this restriking, the dyes were often damaged to begin with, and some became damaged during restriking, some rusted during restriking, and often in these cases the mint would copy the dyes using a pantographic method. And here's an example, the James Lawrence's medal. And I purposely am showing you a copy medal from copy dyes that's struck in silver. This was to emphasize the fact that both restrikes and copies can be found. They're generally in copper, but they can be found in silver. Not all silver versions of these medals are originals. Some are copies, some are restrikes. The James Lawrence medal is also stands out in this series as one of the medals for which the Navy would have struck silver versions for awards, but I have not been able to trace any silver originals. The gold original cannot be traced. So in fact, in this case, no originals are known. And one of the reasons is, perhaps, I don't know if you can see it, there's a crack that appeared in the die while the silver medals were being struck. And I think it's likely that the full order of silver medals, and I think it was either 25 or 50 in this case. I doubt that many were actually struck because I don't think the die, there was discussion of renewing the die or of making a new die, and that apparently did not happen. But in any case, I wanted to show you the restrike and the copy. And in this case, both the obverse and reverse dies were copied. In some cases, the mules are made with one original and one copy die. But in this case, both dies were copied. So the question becomes, how does one distinguish a copy from the original or a restrike? And it turns out to be in the punch lettering. And the reason is that once the medals or the dies were copied, the original punches were no longer available, and different punches were used. And so on the reverse of the medal here, for example, one of the really telling letters is the Q, which is totally different between the restrike and the copy. This is on the reverse. Other letters like the A, for example, is not so obvious. But probably the best diagnostic that I have found is knowing and familiarizing yourself with what the punches that first used to sign his name looked like. This is on the obverse. And at first glance, they may look quite similar, but in fact, when you look at, for example, the S in first punch versus the S in the copy die, and the crossover in the middle here is more or less horizontal. Here it's quite slanted. And once you look more carefully, other differences pop out. The original punches tend to be more squat and wider. These are the copy punches are taller, the serifs are longer, that sort of thing. It is, once you are familiar with the punches that first used, and he took them with him when he took them with himself when he returned to Europe in 1840. So none of the copy dies are going to use his punches. So that's the most reliable way to determine copies from restrikes. Now, all of this is all we're talking now. I'm talking about metals that were struck in 19th century and generally in either silver or bronze copper. So I'm not talking about the modern era versions, which are done in bronze and a sandblast finish. So headaches at the mint. So making these was a heartache for the mint. Lots of problems. The dies were big. The die steel tended to have more flaws in it as a result. The striking pressures were large because of the size of the dies, and failures of the dies were common, and the effort to strike the metals was non-trivial. You saw the Lawrence metal with the crack. There was the final insult for the mint's early experimentation with metal making. Was during the striking of the white metal versions of Thomas Truxton's metal. You saw the white metal version earlier. A big chunk of the die fell out. In fact, it fell out after 53 white metal pieces had been struck. The documents tell us that. And it was a rather dramatic failure. And for having looked at the gold medal, I can tell you that the failure of the die had occurred during hardening because it was already, you could already see in the field of the gold medal that the field in front of Truxton's face was disturbed, that the crack had already occurred. So this is already something waiting to happen. So that was Truxton, but there were a number of problems in many of these metals. Edge damage was common, making edge cuts. This is Burroughs, one of the original silver medals, showing the beginnings of the die failing on the edge, and that die cut just got larger with the striking of restrikes. Probably the most spectacular edge cuts in the series is in the Stuart metals, when they were the original silvers were being struck. Large chunk of the obverse die broke away. There's a lot of evidence that striking the Stuart metals was a particular headache for the mint, without going into the details. But this was a problematic metal to have struck. So I just want to say a few words about mintages and survival of the original metals. And then I'll talk about mintages, numbers of restrikes. Gold originals. So I've been able to track down a dozen surviving gold original metals. You've seen some of them. The Truxton metal, the Preble metal. You saw the Warrington metal as one of the Navy's 1812s, and you saw Winfield Scott's as one of the Army's 1812s. But I also tracked down some others. And so at 12, a total of 12 metals, out of 29, we're talking survival, something over 40%. I suspect there are a couple more out there that I haven't been able to track down, but somewhere in the range of a dozen survivors, maybe, with a couple more. 4 of these are in private hands. The rest are in institutions. 2 of the Navy and 2 of the Army medals are in private hands. And a couple have sold relatively recently at prices that are mortgage your house kind of prices. Now, in terms of the silver originals, now I've got a column labeled ordered, indicating how many were ordered, at least, or discussions of how many might have been ordered in contemporary documents of the, in this case, the Navy Department. 50 were talked about. There's discussion of ordering 50 of Preble's metal. I know of no examples. And I don't think any were struck. If someone out there knows differently, please contact me. But I don't believe any were struck. For the 1812s, if you look at the Navy Department's documents, on multiple occasions, more than one occasion, they talk about the numbers to be ordered, and the numbers for all of their metals would have added up to a total of 500 original silver versions of their War of 1812 metals. Now, I have to point out that the number of officers eligible for awards of these medals was very close to 100, about 1/5 of the number of medals that they ordered. So that's a lot of medals that they did not need for awards. Certainly some extras, understandable, but 5 times the number, that is surprising. And as I pointed out, in many cases, there were difficulties encountered while striking the silver medals. In Lawrence's case, and in others as well, Decatur's, the reverse of Decatur's medal, for example, developed a crack while striking the silver medals, and so on. I think in many cases it may have been that the total number struck and delivered to the Navy would have added up to fewer than 500 medals. Whatever the case may be, I was able to track down something like 77 medals. I might be 1 or 2 more that I have not included here when I do the final count, but that's a survival, a very small survival rate if there were indeed 500 struck, and so that remains a question. A little more than half of those are in institutions, 30 are in private hands, and some of those are in the hands of descendants. So maybe somewhere between 20 and 25 are in the marketplace, either in numismatic market or military market, where these things sometimes sell. White metal originals. So 53 are known struck of Truxtons before the dies failed. 3 are traceable today, or that I've been able to trace. That's a survival rate of about 6%. The Navy in the 1812s mentioned ordering as many as 1,500 of their metals in white metal, and I've been able to trace 3. I don't think it's I think it's pretty clear that nothing like 1,500 was ever struck. And in many cases, for many of the individual metals, probably none were struck in white metal. You did see one of the white metal ones, the Biddle metal that I showed you earlier. And in the case of the Army, on 2 occasions, 2 different secretaries of war ordered, indicated they wanted white metal versions struck of the Army's gold medals. And I estimate that of the 10 that they were referring to, between 25 and 32 of each were struck based on the War Department orders. So there would have been a total of 250 to 320 of these struck. I've located 20, and actually this number is going to grow a little bit, but it's not too far off. That's a survival rate of about 6%. So relatively small number of those surviving. And almost all of those are have been in the numismatic marketplace. Well, so what about restrikes? Well, there's too many of the copper restrikes to track individually. But what I did was, you can, Bob Julian in the back of his book, and as one of his appendices, laboriously transcribed records of numbers of restrikes of each of these metals made. I and others have gone through and pulled out the totals for each of these. So these are the War of 1812 metals, the restrikes shown here in copper. So this is a plot, and on the vertical scale, these are the numbers recorded as being struck. Plotted, this is on this axis. And on this axis is a compilation going through about 35 years of auction records from Presidential Coin and Antique. This is Joe Levine's company. And looking at auction records from Presidential from 1980 to 2014. And Presidential was one of the major players, if not the major player, for much of this time in terms of these metals. But anyway, this is a sample of the marketplace and counting up the number of appearances of each of these metals. So each of these points tells you how many were reported struck and how many times they might have appeared at auction in presidential auction sales. And if these numbers struck are at all meaningful, one would expect that the least number struck would appear the least times, and the largest number struck would appear much more, and that in fact is the case. There is scatter. We don't know individually how the survival rates are with each of these. There may be multiple appearances of a single metal in these sales, that sort of thing. But generally, there's a trend that's showing that the ones that had the highest reported mintages also occurred most frequently. So that tells me that these reported mintages probably capture much, if not most, if not all of the, essentially all of the restrikes that were done. So it gives you an idea of how many restrikes exist between a low of about 35 restrikes to about 160. That's the maximum number that would be if everything survived. How often do they come to market? Well, for the most common ones, there might be a year or two between appearances. And for the least common, at least in this auction series, the least common, you might wait several years before you would see them reappear. So that gives you some idea of how frequently they occur. And I just want to say a quick word about copper originals. I have never seen an original copper, even though they were ordered by both supposedly ordered by both the Navy and the Army. I've never seen an original copper that I consider to be an original strike. And maybe someone out there has one, so I'd like to hear about it. And I'd like to also say that this is was a long effort, and I had a lot of help along the way. And I just wanted to give a shout out to some people and institutions that have given me a lot of help over the time that I've been trying to figure out what's going on with these things. So with that, we got a few minutes left. I would like to, if anyone has questions or comments, I'm open for that. And I'd like to thank everybody for their attention and their interest. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks a lot, Chris. We do have a few questions. First one, the Edward Preble medal you showed had the words Commission Americana below the bust on the obverse. I didn't know these words were used on medals other than those authorized in connection with the Revolutionary War. Do you know if they appear on any other post-revolutionary medals besides the Preble?
Right. In terms of the thanks for bringing that up. I meant to mention that. That's the only occurrence that I know of in medals issued by the U.S. Congress. And as I say, I meant to mention that. And I find it of interest that that's literally Latin for a Latinization of American Congress. But yeah, that's the only occurrence that I know of.
Okay. All right, next one. I own a white metal version of the Isaac Shelby medal issued in connection with the 1813 Battle of the Thames, the War of 1812. Well-known researcher I know speculated that white metal versions of early metals may have been very early die trials produced before the gold and silver issues and issued in very small quantities for test purposes, not for distribution. Do you have an opinion on this view?
Yeah, so it's certainly, it's a reasonable thing because a white metal is so soft, it would be a good way to test the dyes. All I'll say is that that there are multiple records of white metal strikes in white metal being, or the Army medals, by the Secretary or by the War Department, and the orders ranged from well, some of the uncertainty in the numbers ordered had to do with they depended on the cost of striking each one, and the estimated cost of striking each one was $2, and based on the amount of money they had, I gave you the estimates of between 25 and something over 30 of each struck. So I can't rule out that they were die trials, but there's certainly evidence there should be the ones that were ordered for and delivered to the War Department.
Next question. What is your view of original versus restrike of the Preble silver shell medal that was in the Dreyfus sale in 1986?
Right. So the Preble dyes, unlike most of the dyes, ended up with the Navy Department, which was unfortunate in the sense that they were not taken very good care of, and so the restrikes from the original dyes all show dye rust and dye cuts. The shell that is being mentioned, I think, is from the original dyes. That is however it was made from the original dyes, either as an electrotype or the shell was struck and in their good condition. So it was done early. But other than that, I don't know what I can say about it. I'm familiar with the shells, but that's what I would say about them.
All right. Next question. I have several silvered copper versions of both naval and Army medals. Any information about who silvered them or how that was done or when?
Yeah, so I suspect they would have been silvered outside of the mint. Certainly reasonable for people to do it, especially for the Navy medals, because that would be emulating the silver awards that were given by the Navy. But I don't think the mint had the interest or time in silvering them, so I'm going to guess they were done outside the mint.
All right, next one. Are color marks on originals always at 12 or 6 o'clock?
Thanks for that. I should have mentioned that. Yeah, on originals they are always, and there's one exception, but other than that, they are always at 12 or 6 o'clock in every case. The exception is the Stewart medal. If you remember, I mentioned the mint had some difficulties. One of the indicators of the difficulties is that the method of collaring changed while the silver medals were being struck from what looks like a 3-part collar which imparted 3 color marks. 2, the hoop or slotted hoop that produced 1 collar mark. And the earliest of those medals without the cuds are with the 3-part collar. Then we find the ones with the cuds were done with the slotted hoop type collar. So, and then also the Stuart medals are about 20% heavier, about 20% thicker than all the other originals. So all this points to some special difficulties, I think, that the mint was having.
All right, next question. Have you or will you publish your study of these medals?
Yeah, so book is in progress. Thanks for asking. And hopefully before too long.
And then are there any other books that you recommend that cover the medals you discussed today?
Yeah, so Bob Julian's book, he was a pioneer. He did a lot of great work. That's a lot of the basics there. Labatt's book, which is available in reprint, discusses gives the text of all the resolutions and some of the history. And there are others which I'm blanking on right now, but those 2 for sure.
And one last question. You say a word or 2 about the state of Pennsylvania medals.
Yes. So these were also done by Moritz First. They were commissioned by the state. They were struck at the mint. There's a lot of confusion about which obverse goes with which reverse. Bob Julian lists 4, all combinations, all permutations. There were only 2. And without going into details, one was given to Perry and his officers. Yarnall got one. And there was, the other was struck in silver and given to, as far as I know, Pennsylvania volunteers in the battle. All
right. I think that'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, Chris. It was a fascinating overview of the topic, and look forward to your publication on the series.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.